listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. It's been several months now since the president threw us into a mess by calling a snap election. You'd be forgiven, of course, for forgetting that even happened this year. The Olympics did a good job, after all, of distracting us from our circumstances in France. But in the first week of September, Macron finally named a prime minister after 7 weeks or so of meeting with potential candidates and rejecting all of them. But what does this mean for the country, and what does it signal for voters who cast their ballots for the left coalition? In today's episode, I speak with Alexander Hurst, a writer and columnist for The Guardian based in Paris, whose recent op-ed looks into what went wrong and what issues the new government inherits. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
So you're a contributor for The Guardian, as I told everyone in my introduction. And in one of your latest columns, you wrote something that made me laugh, which I don't think was the full intention, but it certainly captured what we're experiencing here politically in France. And you wrote that an analogy for French politics, spoken by your friend, is that scene from Succession when the character of Rogan Lloyd tells his adult children why he won't just pass over the keys to the company to them. And he says, "I love you, but you're not serious people." And you argue that the left-wing coalition that failed to meet the moment this summer in France and show that it could do the difficult work of compromising and working together reflects a similar lack of seriousness. So can you catch everyone up to speed? What was happening during the Olympics that people weren't paying attention to, and why are we now stuck with a right-wing prime minister who seems plucked from out of nowhere?
Right. So exactly. I think there's lots of blame to be cast around. First, I just want to start with, it's understandable why a voter in France would feel really frustrated right now, right? So we had Macron call the legislative elections, and the entire legislative elections were run on this idea that the left wing and the center right needed to band together and vote strategically to keep the Rassemblement National, the far right, out of power. And that happened. And of course, nobody had a majority in parliament. Everybody had a minority position. The left bloc had the most seats of any of the blocs that had banded together to keep the RN out of power. And what happened is a right-wing prime minister who is only going to survive as prime minister as long as the RN doesn't vote to throw him out of power. And so if you're a French voter, you're sitting here thinking, so the party that I voted strategically to block is now the party that is propping up this right-wing prime minister who himself is from a political family that had a very small number of seats and whose party split in half because half of them effectively joined the far right. So does my vote matter? What happened? None of the results of this election were respected. What's the point? So I think there's a vast sense of disillusionment, which is really justifiable and I can empathize heavily with. Of course, in how we got to that point, I think there's a lot of blame to throw at the left as well. And when I talk about the French left, I think for voters who are listening from the United States, for example, we often tend to think of left-right politics as a line, or maybe we approach it with the XY scatter plot to take into account economic differences and social, cultural differences. And when we come to European Union member states, I think we need to add in a third dimensional Z-axis, which is European federalism. Do we want more integration or less integration? And that, I think, allows us to understand why there are really two lefts in France and why they're really incompatible. And what happened is the left had this marriage of convenience in order to, effectively keep the RN from power, or so we thought, during the legislative elections. And then it took this approach that I think is just as disdainful of democracy as what happened. So the far-left leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, has had sort of a mainmise, as you would say in French, on left-wing politics. He really has been in the driver's seat of this car. And after the results of the election, he took this approach of our way or the highway. It's going to be our program, the whole program, nothing but the program, which is totally unrealistic, considering that they had 182 seats total in the left-wing coalition out of 577 seats in the French parliament. You can't say our program, the whole program, nothing but the program when you have a minority of seats. It's mathematically impossible.
Just to pause for a second, he also was technically not even, was he really representing La France Insoumise? He's sort of this figure that just remains attached, but claims to not be the one calling the shots, or at least that's what the rest of the party seems to say, that no, it's not Jean-Luc Mélenchon who's in charge. It's not him who's making all the decisions. We're doing this together. But everyone in other parties fears that actually he's still the one, as you said, with total control over the ideology of the party. So was his role really as codified as what you're describing?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's not codified, and the entire rest of the left really kind of, you can tell they want to emancipate themselves from Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is deeply, deeply unelectable, right? If Emmanuel Macron and Jean-Luc Mélenchon share anything, it's that they elicit this deep rejection among the French electorate as a whole. And so to what extent was Mélenchon technically in the driver's seat? I don't know if it really matters, because effectively he was in the driver's seat. And so the left wing takes this approach led by Mélenchon, and they spend 7 weeks not being able to come to any sort of agreement amongst themselves of who they would put forward as a potential left-wing prime minister. Yet they're complaining, and potentially, justifiably so, that Macron won't name a left-wing prime minister. Okay, but who? And so every time you get a suggestion from the really far left of the coalition, the Mélenchonist left of the coalition, it's clearly not going to fly with anybody who they would need to build a coalition to have an actual majority in parliament. Anytime you get a suggestion put forward from the more center-left part of the coalition, the social democratic wing of the left-wing alliance, it doesn't fly with Jean-Luc Mélenchon's coalition, and so it all gets torpedoed. And so there are a series of names that could potentially build a broader coalition, as happens in other European countries. Belgium, long history of coalition politics, even after really long delays in getting there. Germany, long history of coalition politics. Other European parliaments, this is commonplace. And in France, you just have this series of egos, and of course the 2027 election impending, which kind of gives the impression that the far left didn't really want to govern. The center left probably didn't really want to govern either, because they know it's going to be a shit show, and they're going to have to deal with the results of that in 2027 when they're trying to run for the presidency. The center can't govern because it made this big, bold bet of calling the elections in the first place, and it was handed a smaller coalition and parliament than it had. Nobody wants the far right to govern. And so we end up with this situation where the name that comes out is sort of this mid-level administrator in the Paris city government who has no history of building a national coalition, has no history of being present in European politics and on an international stage, and it doesn't really make any sense. And of course, it doesn't fly.
Right. Now, why does Marine Le Pen end up having a lot of veto power in the end? You mentioned when you first started talking about this that our new prime minister, Barnier, who is right wing, essentially will need to cater to, the far right, who could try to launch a motion of censure that would effectively kick him out. And so there's this idea of, if we're going to compromise with anyone, it's going to be the far right. Why is that?
So I played around with one of those simulators on Le Monde's website where you could try and build coalitions yourself. And essentially, this is one of the kind of tragically funny things in French politics at the moment, is there really are only majorities against everything in the country. And so the only way to get to a coalition involving the center left, it was to have, and not LFI, Mélenchon's party, who all these other parties said was a no-go for them to even consider joining a coalition. And there was like a 6-seat majority that was possible, and you needed to have every single party that was not LFI or the RN, and then you needed to include these regionalist parties, which, maybe they're compatible, maybe they're not. It was really going to be mathematically impossible. And so the minute the left says, well, we will censure Barnier's government, we will effectively have a vote of no confidence to try and bring down his government. If you have the RN join them, then that passes, because now there's a majority against Barnier. If you have the RN say, we'll kind of play this hands off for the moment, then Barnier can survive. Ultimately, I think this really just benefits the RN, because at the moment when it's politically opportune for them to do so, they can, snap their fingers, pull the string, bring it down, and they now get to control the timing of when that happens.
Right. And I want to get more into who Barnier is and why Macron would have accepted him as a leader. But before that, I want to speak to something else you included in your story, which is that it's common for the French left to speak of France as if it's the US. What do you mean by that? Or what did you mean by that?
I don't know if they would consciously say that they're doing that. So I think there's this effect of Americans being kind of so numerous and so loud on social media, and a lot of discussions online playing out in English, where we kind of unconsciously start to view our own political situations and struggles through somewhat of a star-spangled lens, especially when we talk about inequality and other things. I wrote a column for The Guardian a bit over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where I talked about having taken a straw poll of my students in a class that I was teaching at the time at Sciences Po, and asking them to sort of place France in terms of inequality among OECD countries. So I cut all the names off of the graph. I put just the graph up and I said, where's France on here in terms of inequality from highest to lowest in the OECD? And pretty much uniformly, all of the students put it in the top quarter of countries and for inequality, which is where the United States lies. Actually, France is near the bottom in terms of inequality. If you want the actual numbers, the Gini coefficient, which is the measure that economists use to talk about inequality in a society, for the US, it's 0.41, and for France, it's 0.31. So there's quite a significant difference between inequality in those two societies. And so I think it's important for us to always keep in mind what our own contexts are, the constraints that we're under, the incentives that we can try and produce to get to the places that we want to move politics towards and that we want to move social equality and economic equality towards, and sort of the consequences that always trickle down and result. I shouldn't use that phrase trickle down because it makes us think of something that I really hate.
Trickle down economics
that just sort of like spill out from that and impact what we're really trying to do. And so maybe just to put France in some context, because there are serious decisions to make about the budget in France. And to put some of that into context, when we talk about debt, France has lower debt to GDP than the United States does, but almost half of that debt is held outside of France. And so it's not a country that's majority paying itself in the future. A lot of its debt is held by foreigners who are buying French debt and getting the interest rate of return on that debt. It is a more open economy than the US. And what I mean by that is not that it's freer. I mean that 33% of French GDP is imports of goods and services. Only 15% of US GDP is imports of goods and services. So if you do fiscal stimulus, more of that leaks out of France to other places than would leak out of the US to other places. In terms of government spending as a percentage of the economy, in France, government percent of GDP is 57%. It's the highest of any wealthy nation in the world. It's actually the fourth highest in the entire world. So when you hear the idea that France has gone down the path of ultra-neoliberalism would cease to have any sort of meaning in the real world if France went down the path of ultra-neoliberalism. And France is a part of the euro, right? It doesn't borrow in the global reserve currency, which is the US dollar, and gives the United States what a former French president once termed an exorbitant privilege, in the sense that it can continue to emit debt almost indefinitely, and there will always be buyers for it. In France's case, the interest rate on that debt can tick up, and it could put the country into a situation at which point it becomes pretty unsustainable to be paying interest on the debt. And currently it's about 55 billion euros a year. We should keep in mind means 55 billion euros a year that the French government can't invest in education, in research, in healthcare, in infrastructure, and clean energy transition. And so just the idea that people that want to reduce the debt, that's a naturally right-wing position to take, I don't agree with. I think there are times when we should have debt spending, when we should stimulate the economy, when we should go ahead and do that. There are times when it doesn't make sense to continue to add to a large debt that then is trapping you with these interest payments that are diverting money that you could actually be using in potentially more productive ways, especially when half of that debt is held by people outside of the country.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't think I realized about the where the debt was being held, but certainly the figures you included in your piece were quite alarming, and it just suggests that Barnier, who's coming in, is actually inheriting quite a difficult situation. I had also read that France was potentially going to be downgraded. Is that correct in terms of their standing? I'm not super. You're probably more in tune with the economics of all of this, but just that there's a grade, right? The A, it's A
Triple
and B.
A and things like that. And those are important because different pension funds and different investment funds that would buy sovereign debt, they have rules, and some of them are only allowed to invest in, triple A or double A rated debt. And so if it gets downgraded, then de facto there's a whole class of funds that have to sell off that debt, and then interest rates rise, or they can't purchase that debt in the future, which means there's less demand for it in global capital markets. We could get really wonky, but actually what's more interesting to me is sort of the high level, what does this mean for us in terms of a society, and where do we go?
Absolutely, because I mean, the thing that you mentioned, which is the money going toward paying off interest on debt, is money that isn't being reinvested into the country. And there are plenty of services that are so badly in need of funding. And so what is this guy Barnier walking into then? And he was chosen for some very particular reasons. He was the Brexit negotiator. He's obviously pro-Europe, but he is not likely to try to upend Macron's big reforms, the pension reform being one of them. But what else does his role mean for us, and particularly with this issue of debt?
I don't know. When you have government spending that's such a high percentage of GDP and a tax take that is quite high, it's almost 50% of the economy. I think it's around 47, 48% is the tax take, and the gap between those two is the deficit that we're talking about that then adds to the debt. You have limited room for maneuver, right? And I think the government recently is announcing that they are looking at ways to raise taxes on the ultra wealthy and some corporations that are multinational corporations. And this is a place where governments should be looking to raise revenue. But again, one of my frustrations with French politics and really all politics in European Union nation states is that it often is really myopically focused on the national level, when a lot of the solutions that we need to get to are only achievable at a European level. And so I would love to see a radical reimagining of how we talk about national domestic politics and reframing them through a European level. Something like a common corporate tax floor, for example, at a European level that would then be collected up to that point by the EU, replace national contributions to the EU budget, would mitigate a lot of the arguments that you hear from far-right parties about we're sending all this money to Europe. Let's give the EU its own funds. And then we have an entity that looks from a top-down level and says, what's good for Europe as a whole? France and Germany might be competing for, TSMC to build this semiconductor fab in France or Germany. Actually, it really helps Europe as a whole if we have a semiconductor fab in Europe. This is something that's important for the European economy. It will spill out in all these different ways. And neither France or Germany are really going to look at it in that way. For example, if you have Ohio competing against Arizona for a TSMC fab, each state wants to get it. The US government really just cares that TSMC is investing in the United States, that now those semiconductors are part of the US supply chain. So there needs to be some sort of similar approach at a European level, especially if we're talking about the energy transition. It's also something that really only can happen at a European level. If you want other sort of interesting data, I was looking at this earlier. You can find emissions, like current emissions data online. I'm a little bit of a geek, and so I was looking some of this stuff up. What France is generating in terms of emissions actively, and at the moment, France is generating 20 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. That won't mean anything to anybody. It doesn't mean anything to me unless I look at it in context of what other countries are doing. In Germany, that same number is 218 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour right now at this moment. If we go across the Atlantic to the US, to the part that I grew up in, the Midwest, it's 372 grams. If we move a little farther west, we get to 730 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So why do I bring that up? Because looking at our energy transmissions at a European level, you realize that Europe is able to have this really high component of not just nuclear, which France has a lot of nuclear, but of solar and wind, in part because energy gets traded across national borders, right? There's a European market for energy. And if you can't trade energy across national borders, then everybody is duplicating the ways that they're producing energy. If Spain is producing a ton of solar, France can't benefit from it. If France is producing a ton of nuclear, Germany can't benefit from it. But you can trade energy across borders. And so it actually supports the development of more renewables in Europe. And so just in lots of different ways, I would love to see policy take this sort of top-down European look at things of maybe we need fiscal stimulus. Maybe it can't just be done in France by the French government emitting French debt and trying to spend that money in France. Maybe it really needs to happen at a European level and go for really big scale adjustments of how Europe is producing energy, how Europe is incentivizing the reindustrialization of different regions, how Europe is approaching housing policy, even how Europe is approaching its youth. For example, Erasmus is something that lots of university students get to benefit from. What if there were a European sort of civil service year where anybody from 18 to 25, regardless of whether you go into a trade, whether you begin work right at 18, whether you go to university, where you could have an exchange year somewhere in Europe, being placed as a volunteer with an organization working, in the suburb somewhere, in a low-income suburb, or working to help a farm transition to regenerative agriculture practices, in some way creating the sense of Europeanization among the European
More
youth,
unity.
but also then giving people experiences that they can draw from and jump off from in really phenomenal ways.
To your knowledge, are these even plans that are up for discussion, especially the sort of common tax, corporate tax rate within Europe, or is it sort of been vetoed because there are too many member states that aren't interested in playing that game?
I think at some level, everyone realizes that there is a problem with big multinational corporations playing the tax evasion game. And there have been proposals among the OECD to try and have some sort of global minimum tax rate for these corporations. Unfortunately, it's always tough to come to international agreements, especially when certain countries see it in their own narrow interest to undercut other countries in terms of tax rates and then draw companies there. I think this would be something that would be only a net benefit for Europe to do, and there have been proposals throughout the years. I don't know if it's something that's close to happening.
Well, certainly if France were to do that in its own little silo, you know what would happen, which is that people will say, well, these companies are going to leave then. They're going to take all of their head offices and their employees and they're going to move them somewhere else. That's why it works in Ireland. All these big tech companies have their sort of European headquarters because it's fiscally interesting for them to be based in Ireland. Like if we make it too difficult, just like it's the same argument that French people love to make if you talk about taxing the wealthy, well, then the wealthy are going to leave. And I'm not so sure that's 100% true. If there's enough evidence to suggest that that's an inevitability, but certainly Macron doesn't seem keen to be the one to do these things. But do you think that Barnier, who again comes from a more fiscally conservative background and who sees this looming debt as probably the big hurdle to jump over in this first month in office, what do you think he can do, and what do you think might happen?
Easy questions for me today on the podcast.
I know.
What do I think he can do? I think very little. I think marginally they can maybe reinstate some sort of tax that really targets extremely high net worth individuals and households. I would love to see, I think pursuing large tech companies in terms of fines is potentially quite an interesting avenue. A lot of the times we see companies get a slap on the wrist for violating privacy laws, doing other things that are finable actions, egregiously avoiding taxes in this way or that. And a lot of the times we see these fines that appear relatively minimal and they go nowhere near the maximum that would actually start to be a disincentive to engage in that kind of behavior in the future. Maybe they'll start to see that as a little bit of a cash cow. Apple just recently lost a court case that it had at an EU level where Ireland, which didn't even want to, was forced by the EU to collect 13 billion euros in taxes from Apple. This goes back to my common corporate tax rate. You always hear this argument from Ireland that we can't raise their taxes because they'll all leave. Well, if everybody in Europe raised the corporate tax rate to 15%, I think Ireland's is at 12.5%. If the minimum was set at 15%, then what incentive do companies have to pick up from Ireland and move somewhere else for the exact same tax rate, right? So it doesn't make much sense. Like we could universally raise the floor altogether on these companies and start to claw back some of this money that floats around offshore and never is taxed, never benefits services, never benefits people. At the same time, I do think that often I think it's an easy solution. We can just tax more. And what France has actually done well over the past few years is incubate and grow a tech sector. And it's not necessarily that low taxes help a tech sector to grow. I think there are other things that tie into retirement that have more of an impact on Europe's ability to build large tech companies, which is the one thing that Europe is always feeling inadequate about when it compares itself to the United States. And that has more to do with the amount of funding that's available for venture capital. And a lot of the funding that's available in the United States comes from big pension funds like, the CalPERS, the California Teachers Union, which has an enormous pension fund that is funding all of their retirements that gives a certain percentage to be invested in venture capital that then goes into early stage tech companies and fuels them into Googles and Apples and Metas and whatever, as problematic as some of the things that these companies do are. I think when you talk about some of this stuff in France, people have an immediate, very hesitant, very skeptical, very allergic reaction. And again, I would say if we started to think about public policy differently, we can account for some of the ways in which individual retirement accounts are not the solution. And that's maybe not a desirable way to push everybody's retirement. But France, for example, marries public and private funding and delivery extremely well when it comes to healthcare. You and I probably both have a health mutuelle from somewhere.
Yes, a mutuelle.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And so there's this marriage between the social security system and sort of doctors that are practicing on their own, doctors that work at public hospitals, mutuelles that come in as nonprofit additional insurances, and they're really affordable every month. I pay like 72 euros a month for mine, and it boosts reimbursement in a host of different ways. I think you could design a system of public pension funds that sort of function in the same way, and that if we take Piketty at his word, actually, where the return on capital is greater than the growth rate of wages in an economy, would be a way of returning the means of production to workers by having workers own more of the economy and thus benefiting from the gains generated in the economy. But again, I think that some of this is probably way too far out there for the next month of Michel Barnier's prime ministership. And what is he going to actually be able to do? I think not much, to be honest. Really not much. There's no majority for anything.
For anything. Well, and is that supposed to reassure us that the people that have been since named to other ministry postings who are very problematic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-gay marriage, transphobic, all sorts of, really colorful CVs that leave a lot to be desired, or does that mean we shouldn't worry too much about these individuals who are, getting a lot of ire from the voting public, specifically people who voted center left or full left?
No, I think that you should always be worried when someone has, reins of administrative power. There's passing legislation. There's the ways that, the administration functions in terms of attitudes it takes or approaches that it takes. Executive power isn't always dependent on a legislation passing a parliament. So I think it's absolutely concerning and it's disturbing. There are definitely ministers who I wouldn't want as the head of certain ministries.
And one curveball question, we are also in an American election year. And, you said you're from the Midwest. I'm from Pennsylvania. Very, very important state. And a lot of questions I'm getting from the French are related to how likely we think it will go the way the way I think certain parts of the world are hoping it goes, which is to say we avoid another Trump term, which could be very disastrous, especially given this Project 2025. To what degree do you think that the outcome, kind of like the last time when Trump was elected, would have serious implications for a country like France?
I think it has really serious implications for the European Union. It has implications in terms of trade. Trump is a president who believes that the European Union is an enemy. He loves all the autocrats around the world. He has a thing for Vladimir Putin, which remains relatively inexplicable. I think you would see his transactional style of politics really come into play, where he thinks we can, bash the Europeans on this, and we can extract this, and then we can turn around and do this, in the Southeast Asia, and we can extract this, and you would have really a collapse of it would be atrocious for U.S. foreign policy. The United States benefits in so many ways that I don't think it ever actually talks about or acknowledges in public from the global system that it's created over the past 80 years, and also which it disrespects and doesn't feel constrained by, which is deeply regrettable. But I think you could have a collapse of a lot of things, and it would be really difficult for Europe, I think, to be facing China, which is highly cost competitive on lots of exports that it wants to flood the European market with. that result in the disindustrialization of large swaths of Europe, with Russia continuing a war against Ukraine that now the United States is not a part of, or that has flipped sides on. And Trump is, doing actively things to pressure Ukraine to surrender and for Putin to take over as much territory as he can, and then set himself up to do this all over again. And then Europe facing a United States, which is acting like a trade competitor and actively seeking to extract European industry as much as possible to the... I think it would be bad news for Europe, but then it's going to turn around and be really bad news for the United States.
Oh, well, of course.
It's going to be bad news domestically. It would be bad news on a foreign policy level when you've turned all of your erstwhile allies into competitors and people who are benefiting from you. Then don't start crying when suddenly you want a global coalition to, pick up the slack or side with you when it comes to China and Southeast Asia and trade policy and competition and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, the instability that it represents is quite scary, and I think it's important. I think for listeners to remember, especially the listeners I have that are in the U.S., that the implications go far beyond American borders. And I know that's not what the U.S. voter is thinking of, but it does further destabilize the U.S. long after someone like a Trump or some other autocratic leader leaves office, and it takes a lot of time to repair the damage that people
and
like
a Trump
cause.
presidency, just to, I know we both agree on this, but just like to go a step further, it's kind of game over for climate change policy in the world, right?
Well, exactly.
That is something that is already imposing huge costs on us that we don't want to talk about. And it's something that will impose even greater costs on us, especially in the cost to people in developing countries who will be forced to leave en masse and become climate refugees, and the reactions that will elicit in the developing world, which has produced the majority of the problem. I don't want to sound like a whiner and a complainer. I just completed a 2-week sort of half reporting road trip from DC to New Orleans with a French friend.
I was wondering what you were doing in the U.S.
And it was fun to get his comments and observations on things that he appreciated, things that he thought were weird and bizarre, things that were amusing, things that induced rage about the United States. And going through that swath of the country, it was really just kind of eye-opening, because now I've lived out of the country for so long, and Ohio, where I grew up, and Massachusetts, where I went to undergrad, are quite different from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And so it's, I saw fewer Trump signs than I thought we would, but then again, maybe that's because everybody is voting Trump in those areas, and you don't need to sort of
and they don't need to be promoting him.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it was interesting.
You said you were traveling with a French
traveling
friend?
with a French friend, yeah.
And do they feel a level of angst and apprehension about November 5th, and that even if he does lose, that it will, it won't end up like it did the last time with some sort of massive coup? I think that's quite scary for a lot of people who aren't even living in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's quite scary. I think he feels a certain amount of apprehension. This is a friend who follows U.S. politics extremely closely, but had only ever been to New York before. So this was kind of like a first time for him, and in some ways a first time for me to see some different parts of the country.
There's a lot more to report, I'm sure.
There's more to unpack, and maybe in some future columns.
Right. Okay. So I won't give anything too much away, but you will continue to report, I'm sure, on how this situation in France unfolds. But your work is also, you talked about the Olympics, you talk about all sorts of other things. Anything in particular coming up that you can tease that people will read in The Guardian?
Oh, that I can tease. Well, I think some of the observations from this U.S. road trip were interesting. I taught this course at Sciences Po to first-year students 2 years in a row, not this past year, but the previous years. And it was looking at U.S. democracy confronting race and inequality, and looking at sort of Alexis de Tocqueville's famous political science text, Democracy in America. And he has these 5 themes in the book that he traces through, and he says these are really the things that make up the character and the nature of American democracy back in the 1830s. And so chatting with my friend Guillaume, we thought it would be really, really fun to sort of update those. All of those themes are still relevant, and that was sort of the idea of my course. But if Tocqueville had, like us, traveled through the US today, what things would he sort of pick out as being the things that make American democracy what it is? And so I'm really I'm really excited to sort of write a column going through those 5. And I'll just give everybody a teaser. This is a mutual observation while we were driving through the country. Entertainment. That there's a part of American politics that is inextricable from the need to be entertained, and really American life that is inextricable from the need to be entertained.
That is so fascinating. And I think you saw that at play with the Olympics closing ceremony as well, which says all that it needs to say.
I love the opening and the closing. And for the Paralympics, I thought that they were...
Well, sure, but the transition from Paris to LA when LA took over, you could feel the difference. I like to joke that it felt like, the Super Bowl halftime show style taking over, and like that's what we can expect. But we saw it at the Democratic convention with Lil Jon coming out in, what was it? Was it representing Georgia delegates? There was this. I think you nailed something, and I'm now very excited to read.
Well, yeah, we went from like a 5-act opera structure in the French closing ceremony to like this beach party with Snoop Dogg showing up on a tricycle.
Yeah, I'm not sure that says a lot of really great things, but to unpack, as we say. Alex, thank you so much for coming on to explain some of this. I'm sure we're going to need to have an update in a few months' time. And until then, everyone can read you on The Guardian and next year when one of your books comes out.
And I wish I had a publication date to tell everybody about, but
to follow. To follow.
Thanks, Lindsay. It was great to be here.
That's the show for today. Thanks for listening, as always. If you're streaming this on Spotify, be sure to check out a little poll that awaits you pertaining to this discussion. Just scroll down on the episode page within the app and vote. And if you enjoy the show, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, share with a friend, and pick up the books that inspired it, The New Paris and The New Parisienne. Until next time, à bientôt.